Now the United States is focusing on tone policing and making sure that European countries, which are US allies, continue to love Israel and don't pass anti-Israel legislation that they consider would be anti-Semitic. So this was introduced today in Congress, of course, by none other than pro-Israel Zionist Randy Fine. He introduced this today. Take a listen to this absolutely ridiculous speech he gave, and let's discuss it.
Of anti-Semitism, to make clear to our European allies that the conduct that they have allowed to take place within their countries is simply unacceptable. After this assessment, the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs will engage with those countries that are identified as countries of apparent concern and ask for their cooperation in countering this rising anti-Semitism, and it will require those individuals to provide a briefing to both our committee and our Senate counterpart to make sure we are up to date on what these European countries are doing. But make no mistake, and let me say this loudly and clearly, what these European countries have allowed to take place in their countries is unacceptable. And we should be warned that where anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, societal collapse soon comes thereafter. That's what we've seen in 3,000 years of anti-Semitism around the world. So I again want to thank the chairman for bringing this bill up, for making it a priority, for allowing us to say to our friends in Europe that what they have allowed is simply unacceptable and that we in the United States will be watching. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
There we go, guys. There we go. The United States clearly did not have enough of policing the entire world. Apparently, American policing countries, we just haven't gotten enough of that. We have to do more. And this time, instead of building military bases everywhere, we're going to put legislation forward to make sure that they love our greatest ally in the world, the project in the Middle East called Israel. That's the state of America today. That's what we're going to do. And it's going to solve the problem, of course. Of course it's going to solve the problem. Now, nobody's going to be hateful when we have European countries reporting to Daddy America to see what's going on and how critical they are of our daddy, Israel, which basically controls our country. Then that's going to really solve everything. That's going to solve everything. So why do I say that this bill is basically going to be pushed just to manage and make sure that European countries are in alignment with Israel policy? Why do I say that? Well, it's because of the fact that how do you think that guy defines anti-Semitism? Do you think he's defining anti-Semitism in a way that actually targets and is hateful towards Jewish people, which I don't condone? I don't think hate speech, truly just hateful rhetoric towards any group of people for things that they innately can't control, that's wrong. That's wrong. But all of a sudden, when anti-Semitism now becomes conflated with a political ideology called Zionism and the state of Israel, that's a problem. And guess what? The definition of anti-Semitism that this dude and many others like Mike Lawler, who co-sponsored this bill, is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's a working definition of anti-Semitism. Nowhere. It's very, very problematic. Very problematic when you have U.S. legislation using and referencing a working definition, which means that it's subject to change, and the bills that pass through Congress that include the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism include a link to a website that consistently updates. So these are bills that are being passed that just consistently update over time based on the organization that defines what anti-Semitism is, which now includes conflation of Israel and critics of Israel. That's where we're at. So I actually have the bill pulled up because I do want to show you guys exactly what we're looking at over here. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. You should be able to see it clearly now. There we go. So it's HR 6297, and to require the Department of State to provide briefings on anti-Semitism in Europe, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Short title, this act may be cited as protecting Europe from anti-Semitic crime and extremism, or the Peace Act, as they like to call it. Briefing on anti-Semitism in Europe. The Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, in consultation with other relevant officials of the State Department, should assess the persistent and growing threat of anti-Semitism and acts of international terrorism in Europe as a matter of importance to the foreign policy of the United States, and under the Secretary for Political Affairs, acting through the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, should diplomatically engage governments of countries of apparent concern on efforts for transatlantic cooperation to counter and address anti-Semitism and acts of international terrorism that may threaten transatlantic stability, the safety and security of the United States citizens and institutions abroad. No later than 180 days after the date of the enactment of this act, and annually thereafter for 2 years, the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs shall provide a briefing to the appropriate congressional committees on the matter described in subsection A, which I just stated. In this section, the term appropriate congressional committee means the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Senate. So that's the entire bill. Nowhere in this bill do you see that anti-Semitism is actually defined. Nowhere. So now, who is the definition of anti-Semitism? Who's in charge of defining that? Randy Fine? Is that who we're going to leave in charge of defining anti-Semitism? Or how about, better yet, why not Jonathan Greenblatt at the ADL? Is that a better option? Who else do you want to define anti-Semitism? Okay? That is the issue with this bill. Is now, if you criticize the government of Israel, it's really up to whoever's in Congress or an organization that works for the foreign interests of Israel. It's really up to them now to define what that means. So you might remember just months ago, when Ireland passed legislation to criminalize Irish citizens and organizations in Ireland that engage in financial transactions with illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank or occupied Palestinian territories. And all of a sudden, very, very weirdly, we saw a wave like I've never seen before of US politicians threatening Ireland on X. You guys remember that? This was just a few months back. This was about in the summer. A wave. This started off with Lindsey Graham, Mike Huckabee, the ambassador to Israel, and I would say about 10 other politicians, one of them including Mike Lawler. And it was one after another. Within the span of 8 hours, there was at least 10 US politicians threatening Ireland on X. Not only did they threaten Ireland for pushing legislation that made it illegal to engage in financial transactions with settlements, not with the state of Israel, with illegal settlements in Palestinian territories. Okay? Not only did they threaten Ireland, they sent a letter to the State Department telling the State Department that they should review the relationship. They, as in the United States, should review the relationship with Ireland and consider implementing international sanctions on Ireland for deciding to pass legislation on Israel. Did you hear that? That was the situation at hand. So now, let's say Randy Fine gets his way, and this bill that he's pushing in Congress gets enacted. Okay? What then happens to Ireland's legislation that they want to pass on Israel? What's going to happen? Does that legislation qualify as anti-Semitic? Are they going to say that it's anti-Semitic for a country to criminalize sanctions on illegal settlements? Are they going to say, how are they going to concoct this? Are they going to say that Jewish people have a right to, quote, Judea and Samaria, and because their religion tells them they have that right to that land, we must all follow suit with their religion and their religious ideology, and now define that as anti-Semitic? And because of that, we're going to take action against Ireland? What about Spain? Spain recently recognized the state of Palestine. Is that anti-Semitic? Or what if Spain decides that they're going to take things a step further and they actually want to implement steps towards a two-state solution, air quotes, and the way they see doing that is by sanctioning Israel? We're not even close to the idea of the EU implementing sanctions on Israel, like true sanctions on the entire state to impose them on a Palestinian state, which could happen. Israel and Europe. Europe is Israel's largest trading partner, even above the United States. About 28% of Israel's trade in goods come from Europe. So if Europe imposed sanctions on Israel, full sanctions, Israel would capitulate. Israel would literally go into civil war. There would be no economy left. And Netanyahu said back in 2019, so just 6 years ago, he said that if the world imposed sanctions on Israel to retreat from the occupied territories, all of the West Bank, fully retreat, Israel would have no choice but to capitulate because it would not be able to withstand the financial sanctions imposed against it. That is almost a direct quote coming from Netanyahu at a speech he gave at a university in Israel. Okay. So knowing that, that is a threat to Israel's objectives. That is a huge threat. And back in 2019, the level of pressure on Israel was nowhere in comparison to where it was today. Now, has a domino effect set to where we're going to see EU implementing full sanctions on Israel to impose a Palestinian state? No. However, are we in an ecosystem where something like that, where that sort of domino effect might one day be possible? With Gen Z, absolutely. Absolutely. Could it be too late by then? Also, absolutely. But the political environment has changed to where Israel is now turning on its ears and eyes to the idea of that happening. And in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I said this, I called this out 6 months ago. I said that Israel knows that the biggest threat is going to come from the EU, not the United States, at least for the next decade. Why? Because the EU, it doesn't have the lock that Israel has on the United States. Israel, but definitely has influence, major influence on the EU. Nowhere near as much of an influence on the United States. Nowhere near. Okay, it's still there. It's still imposed. Nowhere near. And Israel knew that. However, Israel doesn't need that sort of influence over the EU. Why? Because it has influence over the global superpower, America. And America has influence over the EU. So that's enough. Why does Israel have to put massive amounts of efforts on lobbying every single EU country, which it already does? But why does it have to prioritize that when all it has to do is prioritize having the United States follow its lead, and the United States will place sanctions on EU countries. EU countries follow suit to the United States. Whatever US says, EU follows. So knowing that, Israel was like, well, wait a second. We don't need to worry about EU pulling back. We just need to make sure the United States threatens its allies in Europe to make sure that never happens. And what have we seen? It worked. We have seen that it worked. Why? Because the second that we had US politicians threatening Ireland, all of a sudden the Irish became a little bit nervous. There were Irish nationals that were like, wait, we have to put Ireland first, which I think every country should put itself first. So now there is beginning to be opposition to this bill, not necessarily because of the fact that the bill is something they disagree with morally, but because of the fact that could this hurt Ireland? Could it put Ireland in some sort of crisis or put Irish people out of jobs because the United States sanctioned Irish companies? It absolutely could. If the United States really wanted to go there, it could do it. So now imagine that we have legislation like this passed that Randy Fine is pushing forward with Mike Lawler. Okay. This passes. Do you think that European countries are going to try to bet on what the United States determines as anti-Semitic, or do you think they're just going to try to pull back? They're going to pull back a lot. Do you think they really want to risk what the United States defines as anti-Semitism? Do you think that if there was a bill that imposed sanctions on engaging in transactions with settlements, do you think that EU countries are even going to want to push legislation like that forward? Or do you think an EU politician, okay, do you think a European politician that is nervous to US action is going to second guess the idea of bringing that sort of legislation forward in their government, knowing that the United States might take action against their country and them specifically? Because we know Mike Huckabee has no problem just going on X calling out individuals. We know that Trump has no problem doing that. We know Randy Fine absolutely has no problem doing that. What then? What then? Okay. Since when? We went from being the world's policeman and imposing military bases on every country. Pretty much, the U.S. empire is massive, and now we're going from that to imperialism of thought, American imperialism of belief, American imperialism of free speech. America stands on free speech, but now is America going to be policing what countries say and how they act? I don't see anywhere in that bill that clearly states that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Nowhere in that bill. Actually, they didn't define the word at all. At all. So you tell me, what do you think's going to happen? Knowing how the Anti-Defamation League in the United States operates, knowing how AIPAC, the Israel lobby, operates, do you think they're going to milk that bill every opportunity they get? Do you think they're going to really squeeze the living hell out of it to make sure they get everything they want? Of course they are. Of course they are. Do you see how that opens up a massive can of worms? Now, also, you tell me, when it comes to U.S. diplomacy globally, U.S. is a global superpower, by far strongest military in the world. When you think of allyship between America and European countries, or America with any country in general, we have shifted dramatically from where we were during a president like John F. Kennedy decades ago to presidents that we have now in office, where it went from actual diplomacy to engaging with countries in a way that is amicable, friendly, diplomatic, to now our relationship is threats. And not threats with countries, developing countries, but developed allies in Europe, developed countries. That's now we're having that sort of relationship with these countries where we're threatening European countries. When in history have we ever gotten to that level where it's not just threats about war during the World War I and World War II? It's not about very critical national security threats in that sense, but it's threatening their actions towards a third party, Israel. This is new. This has never happened before. And it's shocking, or actually the better word is it's aggravating, but I wouldn't say it's shocking knowing the state of American politics today. It's a better way to put it. So you can tell now why so many people are concerned about this, and we're going to just have to wait and see how things unfold. I hope that we have American politicians in Congress that are going to recognize this bill for what it is, a threat to U.S. diplomacy, a way to weaken American international standing on the global arena, because we're just going to keep bullying countries now. Let them deal with their human rights issues in their countries. If there are a group of people in Europe that are actually being tormented and receiving hate, and anti-Semitism is rampant, Europeans are more than capable of figuring out how to stop that. I have trust in them that they can enact their own policies and measures to make sure that they are targeting and stopping that effectively. Since when do they need the United States to tell them how to manage hate speech? Since when did that have to happen? Randy Fine now wants to push that in America. We're going to now have America monitor free speech in other countries. No, that can't happen. That can't happen, because you start doing that there, it's already happening here. People start feeling choked. They start feeling choked. They can't say anything anymore. Their livelihoods could get destroyed. Their careers could get destroyed. Their platforms can get erased. James Lee, incredibly critical of Israel. He was recently nominated one of the top 10 finalists, anti-Semitism of the year by Stop Anti-Semitism. I made a previous video on it. He's a good friend of mine. He had his TikTok banned. Why? There's not a hateful bone in the guy's body. He's one of the nicest, funniest guys there is. Love seeing his content. Message him on Instagram pretty relatively often. And he got his TikTok banned for what? For criticizing Israel? You see that? And because of that, he's labeled anti-Semite of the year finalist. that's kind of the situation that's at hand. That's why this is such a big threat. So you guys let me know what you think in the comments. I've went on a long enough rant now. If you found this video interesting, please just go ahead and click the subscribe button below. Also, it would really help my channel grow and reach more people if you share it and give it a thumbs up as well, especially that helps reach more people on the algorithm. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.